Hello, I'd like to welcome you all to this new online course, Talmud for Beginners. In this course, we're going to study a chapter of Talmud. We'll be studying the text, we'll be exploring the many beautiful commentaries, creating real-life scenarios, and ultimately recognizing and realizing how the ancient text of the Talmud, 1500 to 2000 years old, has very practical relevance to our life today. My name is Rabbi Eli Wolf, and the first segment of this course will be approximately 8 weeks. Of course, Talmud study is endless, and hopefully we'll be learning for a very long time, but we'll be achieving the first segment over the next 8 classes. As will be with all classes, we'll have a handout, a resource adjoining the class that will help with the study. So you can download today's class on the screen. There are 4 handouts today. There's a timeline, a very dense timeline, which we'll be briefly working through, and also a map. We'll trace the geographics of the Jewish communities in Talmudic times. Also, there's an outline of the structure of the Mishnah, and finally, a page of the Talmud. What I'd like to do in today's class is to discuss and define and describe what is the Talmud, to provide a history to Jewish academia. What was the evolution of Talmudic literature? Who were some of the great personalities that contributed rich input into the Talmud? And finally, what I'd like to do is to provide a virtual tour into a page of the Talmud. Sometimes the page can be quite intimidating. A foreign language, different fonts, different paragraphs. Let's get a grip on the page of the Talmud so that we'll be able to be ready to study in next class. Before I begin, I just want to briefly describe something about a beginner. What's a beginner? In a certain sense, everyone is a beginner. No matter if this is the very first time you're opening up a page of the Talmud, or you're somebody who has been deeply steeped in Talmudic study for many years, you'll notice that every time you open a page of the Talmud, you're a beginner. You're a recipient to new thoughts, new ideas, new insights that you never thought of before. And so as we study this class, this course together, and we're somewhat of a global community, and everyone is coming from different Talmudic backgrounds, let's all study together. Let's become beginners. Let's all, no matter who we are, become recipient of new ideas, new teachings we've never known before. And now, the Talmud. A respectable scholar once noted that if the Bible is the cornerstone for Judaism, then the Talmud is its central pillar, soaring up from its foundations and supporting its entire spiritual and intellectual edifice. The Talmud in many ways is the most important work in Jewish life today. It's the backbone of Jewish life. This is something not only we, Jewish people, have known, but many nations historically, many of them hostile to the Jewish people, also have known this. Countless times the book was burnt, slandered, destroyed, all due to a realization that a Jewish society that ceases to study Talmud has little, if no hope, for survival. Now, let's discuss some chronology over here. The Bible, the Tanakh, the written law, the Masoretic text, which includes the 5 books of Moses, the books of the prophets, the books of scripture, altogether 24 books. That begins at the beginning of time, about 5,770 years ago, creation. And that takes us all the way through to the beginning of the Second Temple era, approximately 400 years before the Common Era, which was the end of the final prophets. And pretty soon following this began the creation of the Talmud. The Talmud was a collection of centuries of scholarly effort by the sages. And the conclusion of the Talmud is approximately the 5th, 6th century after the Common Era. Now the Talmud consists of two main components. The first one being the Mishnah, which is a very brief and concise legal work written in Hebrew. And the Talmud is a commentary of the Mishnah, a summary of the discussion of the sages throughout the centuries. And this is written in Aramaic jargon. The truth is that the Talmud is a lot more than just a commentary on the Mishnah. The Talmud is thousands of years, a collection of Jewish wisdom and experience. It's a conglomerate of law, science, history, philosophy, legend, medicine, anecdotes, rabbinic behavior, and finally, of course, Jewish humor. The Talmud is traditionally called the Yam HaTalmud, the sea of the Talmud. Why a sea? You ever taken a plane ride over a sea? You look down at the water. It looks pretty dull, uninspiring, plain, flat. But take a dive into the sea, and suddenly a new world emerges. A world of beauty, of greatness, of grandeur. And so too with the Talmud. Externally, it looks like a very technical, complex, legal work. But really, when studied properly and in depth, one is open to beautiful teachings throughout the gamut of life's experiences. There's a sage by the name of Ben Bagbag. We have one recording from Ben Bagbag in Pirkei Avot, Ethics of the Fathers. And he says, Ha'afach ba va'afach ba dekula ba. Turn it and turn it again, for everything is in it, referring to the words of Torah. He continues, regard it and grow old in it, and never abandon it, for there is no greater virtue. The sages have taught us that the Torah, God used the Torah as a blueprint through which He designed and created the world. And so it follows that there's a very intrinsic correlation between the Torah and our world and our lives. And if one doesn't study Torah properly, adequately, then much of our lives and much of our world cannot be appreciated fully and correctly. If you've ever taken a peek into the language, the style of the writing of the Talmud, you'll notice it's a little bit intimidating sometimes. Question, answer, debate, challenge. Everyone's fighting with each other. No one's happy with someone else's opinion. Now this sounds Jewish, but why indeed is the Talmud like this? And so the idea here is that the Jewish belief is that truth can only be realized with rigorous effort, keen speculation, and heated debate. If something comes too easy, it needs to be challenged. It didn't reach an adequate depth. It needs to be dug a little deeper. Another question, another answer, and we question that once again. So the sages have told us that questions aren't only legitimate in Torah study, but are recommended and are somewhat essential. As another sage, also Pirkei Avot, tells us, Lo habaishan lamed. The bashful cannot study properly. Let's refer now to the timeline. There's a lot of information. What I'd like to do is highlight some of the very influential eras in Jewish history, particularly those that were extremely significant in the development and building of the oral tradition. In the Jewish year 2448 from creation, this is the first insert, approximately 1313 before the Common Era, was the great historical moment of the giving of the Torah. Moses ascends upon Mount Sinai and receives the Torah from God. He receives the 10 Commandments, the 2 tablets, which eventually evolved into the 613 commandments, the 5 books of Moses. It's also at this time when Moses comes down the mountain that the beginning of Torah study occurs. And the teachings of the rabbis and the sages and the lecturers in the academies, that began the development right then and there of the oral tradition. You see, it's clear in principle that every text has a context. Every written work has an oral tradition, commentary, adjoining it. No author can invest all of his thoughts and ideas into the text of his book. So how much more so a legal text? How much more so an infinite legal text of divine wisdom, of God's wisdom? Impossible to incorporate everything in the actual text. And so adjoining with that, together with that, was God gave to Moses the tradition, the oral tradition. Now, I want to outline, generally we could say there are 3 tasks of the oral tradition, which I want to share with you now. The first role of the oral tradition is to translate difficult and foreign terminology in the Torah, in the Bible. For example, everyone knows on the festival of Sukkot, one of the commandments are that we take 4 different species and we bind them together and we shake them. The 4 kinds. One of them, Torah describes as Pri Eitz Hadar, a fruit of the tree which is beautiful. Do you know which fruit that is? A beautiful fruit of the tree? An elegant plum? A ripe apple? Without the oral tradition, we wouldn't know. The sages describe for us that this is a reference to a unique citrus fruit, the esrog, which primarily grows in the Calabrian mountains of southern Italy. We wouldn't know this if not for the oral tradition. Or the fact that men are commanded to bind tefillin on their arms, and the verse describes to put totafot on your head between your eyes. You know what totafot are? We wouldn't know without the oral tradition telling us what they are. That's task number 1. The second task of the oral tradition is to interpret and explain cryptic, concise verses and commandments of the Torah. So for example, the day of Shabbat, 1 day a week. Even though it's 1 day a week, yet it's one of the most dense and comprehensive areas in Jewish law. There's an entire tractate in the Talmud called Tractate Shabbat, and in the Shulchan Aruch, the codes, there's chapters and chapters of the laws of Shabbat. How many verses in the Bible tell us about Shabbat? 1, maybe a few more. Lo ta'aseh kol malacha. Thou shalt not perform any work. And what's considered work? What's laborious for you is enjoyable to me. So who defines what work is? And another verse. You shall rest on the 7th day of Shabbat. And what's considered rest? What's rest, relaxing, leisureful for him is boring to you. So who defines these things? How are we to know how to conduct ourselves on the Shabbat? That's the task of the oral tradition. Or how about a more controversial issue? The 6th commandment of the 10 commandments, Lo tirtzach. Thou shalt not murder. Or perhaps, thou shalt not kill. Is killing ever allowed? Self-defense? Time of war? Where do we find answers for these things? Or how about a very pressing issue? Abortion. Is that killing? Is that lo tirtzach? You can pour throughout the text of the Bible, the written law, you won't find answers to these questions. This was the task of the rabbis, to explain, to define, to categorize, and to come up with answers to these questions. Those are the first 2 tasks of the oral tradition. Now there's the third one. The third one differs to the first 2. The first two, the rabbis were attempting to explain, to translate, to interpret the Bible's text. The third role is for the rabbis to enact their own rabbinic tradition. Safeguards, ordinances, customs, different conducts to preserve, to develop, to restore the Jewish religion. You see, we believe that the rabbis weren't just great people like we have in our generation. We all know great people. They were much more than that. The sages of the Talmud were brilliant scholars, profound visionaries. They were in possession of divine foresight. And they understood and they knew what it takes to carry the Jewish religion throughout the generations, through all the different changes of time, through revolutions, through depressions, through persecutions, through the Renaissance, through technological advancements, through everything that we know about, and we're still living through today. The rabbis came up with ideas, not of their own, but with their Ruach HaKodesh, divine spirit, custom safeguards in order to protect, to grow, to develop the Jewish religion. And that's the rabbinic tradition. That's the third task. This, in all, in general, are the three tasks of the oral tradition. What I'd like to do now is, referring to the timeline, back to the timeline, I want to highlight some of the very influential eras in history which contributed to the building of the oral tradition. So if you look at the year 3338, the Jewish year from creation, approximately 423 before the Common Era, we have the destruction of the first temple. Nebuchadnezzar exiles the Jewish people to Babylonia. Most of the Jewish people. Very few amounts remained in Israel. Now in Babylonia, the Jews made themselves at home very quickly. It's a very Jewish idea. They built schools, they built academies, they built Jewish courts, they built synagogues, stores, pizza stores, whatever they could build, they built. Jewish communities flourished in Babylonia. But when it came close to 70 years following the destruction, there emerged a great sage, Ezra the scribe. And he knew that there was a prophecy that God had said that the exile will end after 70 years. And he understood there needs to be a rebuilding of the second temple. The Jewish community needs to return back to Israel. Life here may be good, but it's better. And it's what's supposed to be. Jewish life in the Jewish land with our temple. And so he gathers as many people as he could, not enough, unfortunately, to return back to Israel. He makes the trip, and coming back all excited, inspired, he becomes extremely disheartened when he sees the status of Jewish life in Israel. It had been neglected. It was lying in the ruins. There had been assimilation, the influence of the Samaritans and other native tribes. Jewish people had forgotten their heritage. We're already a few generations down. No connection to Torah, to the Jewish heritage, to Jewish tradition. It was almost lost. And so here Ezra is faced with a daunting and challenging task. Him with some of his friends, Nehemiah and others, to rebuild Jewish life from grassroots level. And so being the great rabbis they were, they had to come up with ideas that would make the Torah and its way of life more appealing, that would be able to preserve Judaism throughout difficult times. Obviously, these tools weren't implemented many years ago because look at the religion today. And so they began to come up with several unique ideas, which we have till today. One example. Everyone knows that if you go to the synagogue on Shabbat, they read the Torah, a public reading. But did you also know that if you attend the synagogue on Mondays and Thursdays, we also read the Torah in the morning services? Never do 3 days go by without the Torah being publicly read. How come? This was one of Ezra's ideas. He felt if we're going to make more public readings, we're going to popularize. People are going to become more familiarized with Torah. That will connect them once again. They've forgotten the Word of God. And so his idea was to make these readings as often as possible. That was a rabbinic enactment. Let's go further. The year approximately, these years are approximate. Unfortunately, history isn't so well documented in the Jewish tradition. The era from 3412 to 3581, the Jewish year, 349 till 180 before the Common Era, we have a wonderful era called the Men of the Great Assembly, Anshe Knesset Hagdola. Now, most events and most of the members of this era we're not familiar with. History didn't do justice to documenting this period. However, culturally and spiritually, this era was one of the most decisive periods in the annals of the Jewish people. Here we had a great body of sages come together and form a Sanhedrin, a great Jewish court. 71 members, the 71 greatest rabbis of the generation, of the time. And they confronted all the challenges. They made the decisions. They provided Judaism with its structured framework that we have today. So perhaps their most landmark achievement was the fact that they canonized the Bible. Who decided that the 5 books of Moses, I mean that for sure God gave to Moses, but then the 8 books of the prophets and the 11 books of the scripture, what makes that into the Masoretic text? That was the task and the achievement of the men of the Great Assembly. So once we have a canonized Bible, we can grow, we can develop as a religion based on very firm foundations. This is the achievement of the men of the Great Assembly. Also, I want to mention 2 other things that they instituted as well. One is that they standardized liturgy, prayer. Up until that time, prayer was something everyone did from their heart, and everyone came up with their own prayers to God. However, they felt that you need to know how to pray to God. You need to know how to, there's sort of protocol how to talk to a regular diplomat, how much more so a president, how much more so a king. So when we speak of the king of all kings, you need to know how to pray. There's a method, there's a system. And the weakening of people's knowledge and spiritual status caused them to forget the method. And they sort of put down pen to paper a text for the liturgy. We're not restricted to that text in the fact that we can add to those prayers. We can't change because they understood what the basic style and infrastructure of a prayer needs to be. Our Siddur, this first Siddur was written right then. The second big institution was the concept of benedictions, of blessings. Blessings before we eat food, blessings before we bring in the Shabbat, blessings on the candles, blessings for the festivals, blessings when we shake the lulav and etrog, blessings before every mitzvah. Nowhere in the biblical text is there a concept of blessing, but the rabbis taught us that all of our lives, from the mitzvahs we perform, to the festivals we practice, to the food that we eat, we need to be indebted to God. And so by making a blessing, we recognize, thank you for giving me this beautiful religion. Thank you for providing me what to eat and what to drink. This was their role. Let's move on. We're following on the timeline. I hope you're sticking with me. In your own time, you can read through the rest. It's extremely interesting. Now, there was a very straining time, famous era, that of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, which many of you are familiar with. In your timeline, you have it in the 3658 to 3685. That was the strength, the climax of that time, because then was a king called Alexander Yanai. And, briefly, the Sadducees advocated religious conservatism. And the tension here was about the oral tradition, the rabbinic law. The Sadducees felt they would need to, be literalists of the text. Read the Constitution, read the Bible, and that's what it is as it says. They even denied in great tenets of Jewish faith, like resurrection of the dead when Mashiach will come. It's not recorded clearly in the Torah. So they denied in that. So they were a heretical group. And conversely, you had the Pharisees, who were very strong to their tradition. They were like the progenitors to today's classic Talmudic Judaism. And it was a tough battle. And when Alexander Yane became king, he had a Greek upbringing, and he aligned with the Sadducees. And because of his power, he inserted lots of Sadducee people into great positions on the court, as priests in the temple and other things. And so this was an extremely difficult time and testing time for the rabbinic tradition. Thank God we got over it. We got over everything. We're here today to tell the story. But this took time. So I just wanted to make mention of that. At the end of the Anshe Knesset Agdela, the men of the Great Assembly, there was one remaining member. The final member, the Mishnah tells us, was Shimon HaTzadik. Shimon, the great saint. And towards his end of his life began the extremely strong influence of the Hellenistic Empire. These were the Greeks, the story of Hanukkah, and we're all familiar with the very luring temptation they gave to many Jewish people. Unfortunately, we lost many good members of our faith to the Greek philosophy and way of life. And so Shimon saw this, and being the great sage that he was, he came up with another very powerful phrase, Asu siag la Torah, make a fence, a safeguard around the Torah. And he instituted very important limitations and conditions on the extent of mingling between Jew and Gentile. Wining and dining and engaging in commerce with each other, it's perhaps allowed, albeit with many limitations and conditions, to prevent the assimilation. Again, a further advancement of the oral tradition. At the end of this time, and I refer you now to the era of the pairs, 180 before the Common Era, and following this, we have a new trend in the Jewish communities. No more is there the uniformity of the one large court, which we spoke about before, but now we have disparate and various academies and schools opening up. We have different leading rabbis opening their schools, each one with their own personality, each one with their own method of interpretation, each one with their own way of ruling. And so we have different schools espousing different opinions about what the law should be in various instances. So the famous ones we'll begin with are Shammai and Hillel. Each one founded an academy. Shammai and Hillel were two very different people. The Talmud is full of hundreds of debates, not necessarily between Shammai and Hillel themselves, but some between themselves and some between their students, who were educated in the philosophy of their academies. Hillel lived a life of great poverty, and so he was very in touch with the grassroots level of the people. He was a man of favor, of kindness, of generosity. Shammai was very disciplined, very demanding, and very hard on the people. And so this sort of personality twist, which is dynamics of their minds, their hearts, and their souls, had influence on their rulings. Hillel's rulings were always more lenient, more giving. Shammai always demanded more stringent. And the famous story that portrays the difference is the convert that wants to study Torah. And he goes to the leading rabbis of his generation. He knocks on Shammai's door. Shammai, can you please teach me the entire Torah on 1 foot? 1 foot? That sounds heretical. We're trying to cover an ounce of Torah in one class, and it's difficult enough. He takes his stick and he banishes the person out of his home. So he goes to Hillel's home. Hillel, can you please teach me the entire Torah on 1 foot? Says Hillel, sure. You ready? What you don't like being done to yourself, don't do to others. That's the entire Torah. The rest is commentary. A profound teaching. Now is not the time to go into it, but that just portrays the stark contrast between Hillel and Shammai, and this you have a trend now throughout Israel and throughout several generations. Different schools, different philosophies, and different methods of interpretation. Who are some other great personalities? Here, we're in a period of time called the Tanaitic era, the Tanaim. Tanaim are called teachers. Tana in Aramaic, teacher. These were teachers which were discussing all the verses of the Bible, and ultimately it was the teachings of these sages that were compiled to make the Mishnah, which we'll talk about soon. So another great sage everyone is familiar with, I hope, is Rabbi Akiva. Akiva came from a very modest background, a family of converts. He was illiterate, no education. He worked as a shepherd. A rich girl cast her eyes upon him. They fell in love. They wanted to marry each other. Her parents were furious. They said, if you marry this man, dumb man, we won't support you. She nonetheless married him. They lived a very poor life with each other, but she saw great vision into her. She saw great potential in her husband. She encouraged him at the age of 40 years old to go and study Torah. She said, I'll support you, you go. And he goes. And he starts at 40 years old to study Aleph Beis, the alphabet. But we know the end of the story. Many years later, Rabbi Akiva is perhaps one of the greatest, most influential sages in the Talmud today. And many years later, he returns back home with thousands of his students escorting him. And when he comes home, his wife comes out of the house to greet him. He turns to her. He points to her. He turns to his students and he says, your Torah and my Torah belong to her, are in her credit. So, a gracious husband. Now I want to tell you about the final Tana. In the last generation of Tanaim, in the 2nd century after the Common Era, the great Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, Judah the Prince. He is so great that we refer to him as Rabbeinu HaKadosh, our teacher, the Holy One, or just Rebbe. When you want to know who Rebbe is, everyone knows. Rebbe is Judah the Prince. He was a tremendous sage. He was a very wealthy person. He was a very politically connected person. We have countless stories in the Talmud about his association and friendship with Antoninus, the Roman emperor at the time. Scholars have tried to identify who this is, Antoninus Pius or others, but it's one of those Roman emperors of the time. Now, Rabbi Judah the Prince realizes that the stability of Jewish life in Israel isn't to last forever. There's going to be some upheaval, economic, political, whatever it is. And he was afraid of losing the Jewish tradition. He was afraid of dispersion, losing memory and knowledge of the teachings of the sages for the past few centuries. And so he made a bold and courageous decision to transcribe the oral tradition. What's so bold? What's so courageous? Because the oral tradition is supposed to be oral tradition. And the rabbis warned very strongly against transcribing the oral tradition. What was their concern? Lest someone mistakenly endow and give the same reverence and respect to the oral tradition that he's supposed to give to the written law, the Word of God. There had to be some sort of, dividing line that differentiated one from the other. So one was supposed to be written and one was oral. Yet Judah the Prince made the following calculation very bravely, that it's either committing the offense of transcribing the tradition or at the cost of losing the entire tradition. And he decided, I'm going to write it down. And he worked very hard. A very difficult job. Can you imagine collecting teachings and sayings? There was no internet, no computers, no libraries. For centuries of academies, going back to the great uniform court the Jewish people had, and then throughout the many academies and all the different opinions and the arguments and the debates and the discussions back and forth, and he has to put it together into a concise legal work. He did just that. And he authored the Mishnah. And this closes the Tannaitic era with the Mishnah. How is the Mishnah structured? So you have your handout, the 6 orders of the Mishnah. I'll go through it quickly. You can look at the page. There were 6 orders. This is another unique contribution of Rebbe. Up until that time, all the teachings of the sages were just ongoing with the verses of the Bible. And there was no order. And if you wanted to look up a particular subject, how would you find it? It's spread around the entire Bible. So Rebbe put everything in an order. And he had the 6 orders of seeds, holidays, women, damages, the sanctified, and purity. All in all, 60 tractates. We'll be studying, if you look into damages, there's the first 3, Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, Bava Basra, the first gate, the middle gate, the last gate, which used to be collectively one large tractate called Nezikin, called damages, that was then subsequently divided. We'll be learning the 3rd chapter from the tractate of Bava Metzia, which we'll talk about in next class. So that was the order of the Mishnah. There's, I think, 516 or 517 chapters in the Mishnah. And the Talmud altogether has close to 6,000 folios. That's what Rebbe did. Now, following Rebbe, after he passes away, so indeed, life becomes very tumultuous in Israel, and no longer is there a center for Jewish life. But moreover, there was no real one successor who could fill the shoes of Rabbi Judah the Prince. Instead, you had his group of students all venturing out, trying to find a safe place to live, to teach, to set up a school, and to continue the tradition. These were called Amoraim. This began the Amoroic era. Amoraim are interpreters. Now that we've been equipped with a written code, it's brief, it's cryptic, it's concise. Nowhere is there mention of all the debates and all the arguments and the theories. So we need the interpreters to come and expound and explain and to come up with new. Generally, we have a split geographically. If you look at the map, we'll follow the paths of the Jewish communities following Rabbi Judah the Prince. And this is in the 3rd century after the Common Era. 2 great students of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi moved to Babylonia, back to Babylonia. Rav and Shmuel. Rav's name was Rabbi Abba. Some called him Abba Aricha, the tall Abba. And Shmuel. Rav moves to Babylonia, somewhere in Iraq, today to a place called Sura. And in Sura he establishes an academy, a wonderful academy. It lasted about 800 years. At some point in time he had about 1,200 students. Very successful. And his friend Shmuel opened another academy in Naharda, a little bit northwest of Sura, and then later on he moved to Pumbedisa, which sages, scholars have identified perhaps as Fallujah in Iraq today. So this begins the Amoraic era in Babylonia. And you have these expounders of the Mishnah from several generations. 6 generations. 6 generations later, there is a man named Ravi Ashi, a very similar character to Judah the Prince. Great sage, very wealthy, and very well politically connected. He too realizes that no longer will life be secure and tranquil in Babylonia. And lest we lose the Amoraic traditions, we need to redact a Talmud. And so he works very hard, putting together all the discussions of the sages, both from Israel and Babylonia. He works for 60 years. He doesn't succeed in finishing it. He passes away. His student Ravina completes it. And now we have approximately 500 after the Common Era. We have the final product of the Babylonian Talmud. And this is the Babylonian story. What about the Israeli story? Life in Israel. Well, we have another great student of Rebbe. His name was Rabbi Yochanan. And he opens up an academy in Tiberia. Others go to Caesarea. Others go to Tzipori, more in northern Israel today, opening up academies. Their method is very different to the Babylonian method. The method developed by Rabbi Yochanan, he was very creative, was one whereby he interpreted the Mishnah and the verses of Bible in a much more simplistic, straightforward way. So if you look at the styles, the trends of writing in the Israeli Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud, it's a lot more brief, a lot more concise, whereas the Babylonian Talmud is extremely extensive and lengthy with much debate. The Romans were losing their power in Israel pretty early on, and Christianity was becoming the lead religion of Israel, and this was a very difficult, dangerous time for the Jewish people. So already around towards the end of the 4th century, the Jerusalem Talmud is quickly redacted before dispersion and persecution occurs. So it's a much quicker job and ended a lot earlier. So we have now the two Talmuds, the Babylonian Talmud and the Palestinian Talmud. It's called the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, but it wasn't made in Jerusalem. Jerusalem then was a Roman capital. The Palestinian Talmud. Which one is more important, is more significant? So a student of the Talmud or of Jewish law knows that a lot more credence, a lot more weight is given to the Babylonian Talmud over the Jerusalem Talmud. Why? So the simple answer and the deeper answer. The simple answer is that the Babylonian Talmud was edited and compiled more than a century after the Jerusalem Talmud. And so if you are being printed and redacted later, you have the opportunity to view all the conclusions and the writings of the book that's printed earlier, to further develop them, to crystallize them, to perhaps modify some of them. Obviously, a work that's printed later is going to be more perfected than the one printed quicker. That's a simple answer. But on a deeper level, Chassidic masters have told us. Imagine the following analogy. The glasses are off. You're looking for your glasses somewhere in the room. If you're looking in a lit room, so albeit that your eyesight isn't perfect and that's why you're wearing glasses, it'll take you a little while to find, but pretty easily you'll find them. If you're in a dark room, you're going to grope around, you're going to stumble, you're going to fumble, you're going to fall, you're going to get back up. Finally, you'll find the glasses. That's the difference in life in Israel and life in Babylonia. Israel is a place where the godly presence resides the strongest than anywhere in the world. It's the Jewish homeland. And so studying God's Torah in the land in which He resides most is a lot easier, a lot clearer. Results and conclusions are arrived at quicker. Whereas studying Torah in a spiritually darker place, that of Babylonia, more distant from Israel, takes a lot longer, a lot more work, more question and answer, more falling down, more getting back up, and then finally arriving at the conclusion. And as we discussed earlier, truths are arrived at through lots of debate and lots of challenging and lots of questioning. In fact, we encourage questions and feedback. And if you have questions about what we're studying, you'll ask them and we'll try to respond to them as best as we can. Now, in the short amount of time we have left, I want to make a few comments. First of all, let's take out the final handout, and that is the page of the Talmud. This is a copy of the very first page of our chapter which we'll be studying. That's why I chose it. And you have just some comments to learn your way around. The middle text is the text, the body of the Talmud. You have in the beginning the Mishnah, which is the first 10 lines or so. And then if you notice, there's a square box I've made square. It says Gimel Mem, Gemara, which is the Aramaic for Talmud. That begins the commentary on the Mishnah. That is the central text. On one side, you have a classic commentary known as Rashi. Rashi is an acronym for Reb Shlomo Yitzchaki. He, 12th century in Troyes in France. Today, he's the universally most accepted, simple, straightforward, literal commentary on the cryptic Talmud. Talmud is Aramaic, it's difficult, there's no punctuation, there's no grammar, when does it start, when does it end, what are some meanings? Rashi is a simple interpretation of the Talmud. You can't study Talmud without Rashi today. On the other side, you have the commentary of Tosafot. Tosafot, 13th, 14th, 15th century, were a school of rabbis. Their work is a lot more analytical, cross-referencing, bringing passages from elsewhere in Talmud, analyzing the two together, making questions, contradictions, providing solutions. That was the role of Tosfos. There's a tradition that says that there were 60 members in the school of Tosfos. Each one went ahead for a couple of years and studied one chapter of the Talmud. Then they came back and convened in a large room around a large table, and they started from the beginning. And whenever there was a quote from a particular tractate, they turned to that member who had studied that tractate, you tell us about it. And then it was discussed, and then they went further. So it's an extremely enlightening and enjoyable commentary to study. The top you have, on one side the tractate name, on the other side the chapter name, the chapter number, page numbers are in Hebrew. This is Lamed Gimel Amud Beis 33, side 2. Various places you have Talmudic cross-referencing if you look at the left-hand side. In one very beautiful work, you have references to primary halachic codes. If you want to know what's the halachic ruling of this passage, how did Maimonides look at it? How did other codes, the Shulchan Aruch? This is a reference to where you can find it in the codes. You have quotations for biblical verses, etc. That's the bulk of what we need to know in order to get around the page of the Talmud. A lot of the times you'll notice that the commentaries are really sometimes just clarifying the version, the text, what the correct word is supposed to be. If you think about it, there were no printing presses 1,000 years ago. Everything was work of hand. Difficult. There weren't too many copies available. And what happens when you have a work of hand? Mistakes creep in. I was once, I remember, in Oxford in the Bodleian Museum, and I saw a beautiful work of Maimonides. And inside there was an inscription, handwritten, the whole work. And the inscription was from a father to a son who said, "Happy birthday, in your honor I have transcribed Maimonides." Beautiful. But how many mistakes crept in throughout history? And so that was a task of the commentaries, is just to correct the text very often. And it's no wonder that at the end of the 15th century, Jews jumped on the bandwagon for the printing press. And in 1530, Pope Leo gave permission to a Christian printer to formally print the Talmud. And it's ironic, and I'll tell you why it's ironic soon, that the format of the Talmud as we have today in this image, with the Talmud in the middle and the commentaries on the left side and the right side, were all designed by the Christian printer Daniel Bomberg. It's gone through minor modifications, but that's how it is. And why it's ironic is because who, if not the Christian people, were so abusive and persecuted the Jewish people and the Talmud throughout history? Book burnings from the 7th to the 8th century to the 12th century. Talmud was burnt, it was slandered, it was censored. It went through very difficult times. Thank God today we have plenty of printing presses. We have institutes in Israel and in America that work hard analyzing ancient manuscripts, correcting another word and another detail and another punctuation, perfecting the text that we have today. So Talmud is abundant, and there are plenty of prints, all different styles, each one more beautiful than the next. Today we have no excuse for not spending time studying and becoming proficient in the Talmud and all the other Jewish works. Let me conclude with a final passage on our timeline. The year is this year, and the personalities are you and I, and the verse I've quoted is Torah Tziva Lanu Moshe Merasha Kihilat Yaakov. The Torah that Moses commanded us is the heritage of the congregation of Israel. It's my Torah, it's your Torah, it's all of ours. You don't have to be part of a special lineage, special family to study Torah. It's the gift, the inheritance of all of us. There's a beautiful teaching before we mention that God gave the Torah on Mount Sinai, in the Sinai desert. Now, God was giving the Torah to his people, choosing them as a nation. Couldn't he have found a more elegant, scenic place to give the Torah? On a coastline, in a beautiful resort, lovely architecture. Why in a desert? No man's land. You know what the sages have taught us? Because a desert, in addition to being no man's land, is every man's land. It belongs to me, to you. We all have equal rights to roam around there. And we all have not only the right, but the obligation to study Torah, to become proficient as best as we can, to put in as much time as we can. Perhaps the legal rulings will leave for the rabbis, for the courts, but the Torah study, the Torah theory and practice, we all have the right and responsibility to do. So, thank you for joining in this first class of the series, of the course. I'm looking forward to seeing all of you in next class. And for now, goodbye. Hello, and welcome back to the next class in this online series, Talmud for Beginners. In last class, the first class, we briefly, as much as we could, we discussed the history behind the oral tradition. We traced back how things evolved. The Mishnah was redacted about the 2nd century, and then following that we had the Tanoim, the Amoraim, which interpreted the Mishnah, and that ultimately became the Gemara, the Talmud. You had the Babylonian Talmud that was redacted in approximately the 6th century, and the Jerusalem Talmud approximately the 4th century. Following that, we have the commentaries, the Gaonim, the early medieval commentaries, and then the postmodern commentaries, the Achronim. And that was the introduction before we